I'm Aaron Ross Powell, and this is Reactionary Minds, a project of the UnPopulist. A good way to understand the appeal of Donald Trump is to talk to the people who voted for him. And one of the most interesting ways to approach that is to talk to voters in counties that flipped, long voting for Democratic Party candidates until suddenly, in 2016, they didn't. That's the background for Trump's Democrats, a book that looks at three communities that turned to Trumpism after having been solidly blue basically forever. I'm joined today by its authors, Professors Stephanie Muravchik and John A. Shields of Claremont McKenna College. Their fascinating book explores why Trump clicked with these voters and why many of the very things that turned so many of us off about him were the very things they found so appealing. We discuss machine politics, political bosses, honor cultures, localism, and what it means to identify strongly with a narrowly circumscribed place. The story that emerges is a good deal more complex and nuanced than the easy tales we sometimes tell ourselves about us and them. Your book is part of a genre we have seen come out of the Trump years of academics and journalists going to small towns that voted for Trump, sitting in diners and asking Trump voters why they believe what they believe. But I think your book is the best example of that I have come across, the one that I've certainly have learned the most from, and the one that puts the most work into really getting at the ideas motivating Trump supporters. Can you tell us a bit about what prompted this and how you approached this project?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Thanks for having us. Thanks for the compliment. This is a book that really started on election night in 2016, like lots of Americans. I'm sure, like yourself, we were up late that night watching the returns come in, and it was really the most astonishing and surprising election in our lifetime, in our living memory. And so immediately we were really eager to get out into the, outside of our little academic town and get a feel for what had happened. And really in the weeks that followed, our sense of surprise really deepened because first we discovered that there were all these Obama Trump counties, right? So there were all these places that had been, had voted for Obama on two occasions. In fact, there were over 200 some counties that did this and then flipped for Trump. And so that itself is very surprising and unusual, especially in this age of polarization where partisan IDs and loyalties are especially sticky. But then quickly we discovered that not only had these, were there all these Obama places that flipped for Trump, we also discovered that a lot of these places had voted Democratic for a very long time, so many of these places had a pretty unbroken record of voting for Democratic presidents, stretching back some to Reagan, some to Nixon, some much further back. In fact, one of the counties we ended up studying was a place that had never voted for a Republican president in its history. This is a county formed in the 19th century, and it's really astonishing, right? Had never voted for a Republican. It's probably in the Western world, probably the longest streak of any polity just voting for one party. And so that was interesting. And then, and of course we're accustomed to thinking and talking about the Nixon Democrats in 72 or the Reagan Democrats in 84. But in some ways, in lots of ways, actually, the Trump Democrats were much more interesting. The Nixon won in a huge landslide in 72, as did Reagan in 84. So it's not so surprising in those years that you get lots of Democratic places that flip. That's not weird. But in 2016, you had, Trump lost the popular vote, and yet he managed to win. He managed to win some of the most loyal Democratic communities in the country, despite that. So we got really interested in not just a sort of red-blue divide, but a divide that had opened up in blue America. And so we were curious. We wanted to make sense of what had happened. Why, in our college community, Trump is a loathed figure, a sort of proto-authoritarian, a dangerous person. And, we more or less agree with that point of view. I think there's a lot to that. But But then there's all these other Democratic communities that see him in exactly in a radically different way, and they see him as one of the greatest presidents of in American history. And so we were really deeply interested in that question, and then all these places we studied in 2016, I should add, remain loyal to Trump in 2020. And so these are places that are really drifting into the Republican Party, and Trump is the character who brought all those, shepherded all these communities into the Republican column. And so that's quite interesting. So that's how we got interested in the project.
You mentioned the Nixon and Reagan and so on, and we have seen Trumpism represents a populist movement. We have seen prior waves of things that look like populism, the most recent probably being the Tea Party movement. And as you point out, the three communities that you looked at didn't go Republican. They didn't vote Tea Party candidates. What was different? Was it something about that had happened to them, i.e., economic changes had happened that had hurt these communities and said, now it's time to vote for Republican? So it was something about the community, or was there something that really set Trump apart from past populist candidates or waves?
Well, I think one piece of it is just how deeply blue these communities were, and that the Tea Party really emerged out of places that had some significant Republican organization, movement, identification, and that there simply weren't enough Republicans on the ground to get attention for. In most of the places, Iowa might have been a little differently, but certainly in Rhode Island and Kentucky, we had one Democratic sort of local level party leader say to us in Rhode Island, we were asking him about his relationship with Republicans. He said, I don't know any Republicans in this town. I don't think there are any. There just wasn't even enough for the most knowledgeable Democratic leadership to know them. And so I think part of it was that it would have been hard to get the attention of the local Democrats. And then the other piece that I think stands out is that there was a lot of libertarian rhetoric out of the Tea Party. There's some controversy about how top down that was, how astroturf that was, et cetera. But that libertarian rhetoric is really not at all resonant with the Democrats that we talked to. That was not the piece of the populism that appealed to them. So I think that's another piece of the answer. I don't know, John, do you have?
Well, yeah, I would just simply add, I guess this is really echoing what Stephanie said, but you have to keep in mind these are really one-party towns. And so, and the party locally for these folks is really the individuals who lead the party, right? So the county level or town level elected officials. So these are mayors, city council people, county commissioners, and they're really sort of the face of the party. And in a lot of ways, they'd insulated, the other thing to add to this, they'd really insulated these local communities from national politics in some ways. So in a lot of ways, these places were pretty provincial. When they thought about the Democratic Party, they didn't think about national leaders for the most part. They thought about people in their own community. And so one of the things that Trump really did is he really shook these communities. It was sort of a shock to them, and really got them sort of thinking about national politics and questions and controversies. And it really took someone like a Trump to do that. So the Tea Party was something that just didn't, it was a movement that was pretty remote from a lot of these places.
One of the really interesting parts of this book is when you're talking about how politics worked or works in these small towns, and how, as someone, I'm reading it sitting inside the Beltway, having that as my frame of reference of politics. I've mostly lived in big cities and so on, and where national politics is about, during the Trump years, it was that he's pushing up against the guardrails, if not, leaping right over them. We have our norms and institutions, and that's the way that we tend to talk about these things. And it was fascinating, the stories that the two of you tell about how different politics is in these small communities. Can you talk a bit about that? Because that also, you say, plays into a part of Trump's appeal.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things that really struck us, Aaron, is that in these communities, politics is much more Trumpian in all kinds of ways. It was Trumpian before Trump, right? So the local public officials reminded us of Trump in various ways. They were thin-skinned, they were brazen, they were tough, they were macho. They were sort of the local daddies of their communities, right? They were sort of there to take care of their flock. So that is to say, they weren't particularly ideological. Rather, it was a sort of friends and neighbor politics, right? They were going to do particular favors or provide for particular constituents. It echoed back to a sort of machine politics, which has deep roots in the Democratic Party. So politics in these places weren't very ideological, really. They were much more boss-centered, right? They were about, they were really about providing for and taking care of local constituents. And so political leaders were expected to do favors for their constituents. And so we saw all of this in all kinds of ways. Maybe Steph wants to just jump in and you could give some examples to give some flavor and feel for some of these characters.
Yeah, there were in all three of the places in this town in Rhode Island, this city in Iowa, and this county in eastern Kentucky, there had been a strong boss politics, and perhaps most strong in Kentucky, which these little rural counties are often dominated by these people called judges. They're not judicial figures; they're they're county executives, essentially. There was a man in the county that I was looking at who had held office almost continually for about 30 years. When I arrived there, during the Trump administration, he had been out of office due to the fact that he had been brought up on federal charges in a votes for gravel scheme. This was after about some 30 years of office. The county had fallen on hard times. And so the main way that he was able to show his friendship to voters was by providing loads of gravel to them at county expense. And so a lot of these people live on little sort of far-flung farms in this rural district. And they need to have little roads that connect their farmsteads to the main sort of public arteries. And they need to be constantly refreshed with gravel. And he was dumping loads of gravel before, in the months leading up to an election. And so the feds came after him, and he pled. I mean, he had to deal with them basically that he would not be, he'd go, sort of be free, but that he pledged never again to run for office. And so the county sort of political imagination had been very shaped by this man's long reign. And he remained a very popular, although controversial figure in the county when I was there.
Yeah, and there was echoes of this too in another town we studied, which is Johnston, Rhode Island. And on the surface, you might think it would be a place with a radically different politics than Appalachia, right? It's in New England. It's a suburb of Providence. But in many ways, actually, the politics was really similar. It's a very Italian-American community, and they still practice a kind of old-style machine politics. The mayor there is Joe Policina. He rules with an iron fist, and he's sort of like everyone's daddy, right? People go to Joe, they need something done, they need a favor. Sometimes they ask for things he can't deliver. So when we asked Joe about this, he said, yeah, sometimes they'll come in, my constituents, and they'll ask for something off the wall, and Joe will have to tell them, gee, I can't do that. That's illegal, but I can do something else. And likewise, people in that community feel like if they don't support the machine, if they don't support Joe Policena and other Democratic candidates, that they'll be basically shut out, right? That they won't be able to get their any goods from the city because they'll be punished by the mayor, right? Who can be very vindictive. So again, very different seemingly kinds of communities. They're regionally different. One's rural, one's suburban, et cetera. But a very different style of politics. But it's a kind of politics that used to dominate the Democratic Party. And we sort of forget about it in college towns and big urban cities because we've cleaned up this kind of politics, right? We want we want a politics that's more policy oriented, a politics without nepotism, without wheeling and dealing and this sort of favoritism. But it's a kind of politics that survived in a lot of these Democratic communities. And it survived in those places because there are fewer sort of college educated, good government types who wanted to clean up this kind of politics and get rid of it. So that's one way in which the politics of these places was distinctive. But they also had a particular political culture, and we could talk about that if you like, Aaron.
Just briefly before we turn to that, I'm curious, do the people in those towns view this as a kind of politics that needs to be cleaned up but just can't for various reasons? Or do they think this is the right way to do politics, even if it sometimes is a little messy and looks kind of corrupt?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a view among some voters. I mean, these men are all, and they're all men. These men are all somewhat controversial and have their detractors who don't like how personalized the politics are. I spoke to one. Mayor Policena in Johnson, Rhode Island, is very widely popular. He gets very high margins in elections, and lots of people had lots of good things to say about him. But he did have his detractors, and I was trying to talk to one of them, and he was quite anxious about talking to me and sort of said, well, you know how things are in this town. And then he sort of paused a beat, and then he said, well, you're not from here. Maybe you don't. And so there was this sense of like, that there were critics, and they would often say this is too personalized. There's too much retribution for disloyalty. This is America. We should be able to express alternate opinions and not be sort of personally penalized by the powers that be in our locality for this. One colorful example from Elliott County was, the executive, who was no longer in office because of this federal deal, had one very outspoken opponent in the community, and when they would be paving roads, like county roads, the new asphalt would stop at this man's property line and then start up again at the next property line. So only in front of his farm would there be no paving. So that kind of stuff rubs some people the wrong way, for sure.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, I think it was, somewhat mixed, but I think there was also a sort of sense in these places that this is just how one does politics. This is sort of the main models of politics. And it wasn't clear, I think, to many what sort of the alternative to this might look like. And in many ways, it's a sort of model that grows up, out of their own community. It's the kind of politics that grows out of the traditional family in some ways, right? It's this sense that, well, there's a patron, sort of patriarch who's sort of the head of the household, but also the head of the community, and they should provide and take care of their community, and in exchange, they should get the loyalty of their constituents and their supporters. So there's also a sense that, that their loyalty is the main way that they pay back their benefactors, right? Those who have supported them. So even if they have some misgivings or grumblings, or they think the mayor can be a little too iron-fisted or whatever, there's also a sense that they should be loyal to that person because they owe them something.
Given all of that, and given the personal and transactional nature of the politics, and politics as extended family, as you describe it, if the initial motivation of this book and the ethnographies that you conducted was there was something new about Trump or Trumpism or Trump as a candidate, and it attracted what had been historically very, very blue, exclusively blue communities. So these were Democratic strongholds. But given all of this, within this context, what does it mean for them to have been Democrat? Because you said this wasn't really about policy per se. So were they meaningfully Democratic in the way that we would think about it, from the perspective of looking broadly at American politics? There's Democrats represent a set of policy preferences and a certain coalition. Do they even fit within that? Or was it more just this was a label, but they could have had a different one slapped on and it would have been meaningfully indistinct?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that became very clear was that because of the relationships with these sort of party elites in their local community, and that the party, what the party meant relationships with these local party leaders, and what they understood Democrat to mean had been very much reflected or filtered through these local party leaders. A lot of their, I would say, social cultural ideas were quite conservative, and some of them made a point of saying, "I'm a Democrat and I'm a conservative." And so, for example, we met a woman in Rhode Island who was from a deeply political family. Herself had been a local level, sort of low local level political leader. So not someone who was out of touch or disengaged at all. And she talked about the revelation that the Democrats were pro-choice. And for her, this was kind of a shock. She had to wake up to this fact because she herself and her family were fierce Democrats. She had been told since she was a child that if the Republicans get into power, we'll all starve. And it was that kind of rhetoric we heard from a lot of people. But she was also from this deeply Catholic, church-going, mass-going family. And she said she would go to Mass and see her elected local leaders also taking communion. And it never crossed her mind that these people would not be pro-life. And so on a lot of the social cultural issues, there was in Elliott County, which was very rural, the issue, one big issue had to do, of course, with guns and the Second Amendment. All the Democrats were very pro Second Amendment in Elliott County, and it never, they didn't feel a sense of cognitive dissonance because the party was so locally, their understanding was so local.
Yeah, it's good. And as Stephanie suggested, too, I mean, in some ways, they do have a sense that, I mean, as Steph mentioned, I mean, they have a sense that Republicans are the party of the rich. So that sort of resonates with what a lot of Democrats might say about the Republican Party and have said for a long time. But it's a very sort of class-bound, sort of New Deal Democratic sense of the parties. And so, and indeed, I mean, in some of the restaurants in these towns, it was not uncommon to find pictures of JFK or FDR. So they had a sense those were sort of the patron saints of the party. They did have a sense that there was that they were part of something larger than their own local particular community. But as Steph mentioned, I mean, they didn't. It's true. I mean, it's sort of like the culture wars were this thing that was sort of blowing beyond their own. Their own local lives, and they didn't have a sense of where the parties landed on guns or abortion or those kinds of questions, and that surprised us. That was interesting, and in lots of ways, of course, these people are, on a lot of these issues, they're kind of conservative. These are they're pretty pro Second Amendment. They're fairly pro life. And although on economic questions, they're more moderate or even left-leaning. In Ottumwa, Iowa, for example, it's a place with a big meat packing plant. There's a strong tradition of unionism there. So basically, it's sort of like, if you froze the northern, the Democratic Party in the North in like 1960 and took a peek at it, It's more like what these places are like. And it almost felt like going back in time a little bit to be in these communities, right? Like we got to peer at the old Democratic Party as it used to be. And we were reminded that it didn't all change overnight, that there are still these vestiges of this old party that have endured, partly because they're kind of isolated and they have this strong localism, and the local elites sort of buffer them from some of the big changes that are happening at the national level. And indeed, if you talk to local people, one of the major things they're trying to do is create their own brand, right? Because they know that there's a big ideological divide between them and the National Party. And so they want to, keep the Democratic Party as localized as they can. And Trump has made that a lot harder for them in all kinds of ways, because a lot of these folks are starting to think, are starting to become more aware of the National Party and the ways in which it's different from their local party.
So one of the broad theses of your book is that Trump appealed to these communities in part because the very things that those of us in our coastal, rootless, cosmopolitan enclaves were dramatically, viscerally often turned off by about him were the very things that felt the most familiar to the voters in these communities about him. And so just discussed, he looked like the politicians that they're used to. And so what we saw as corruption, as like wild corruption and nepotism and so on, was just business as usual. That's, of course, how politicians operate. So I want to move to another one that you discuss, which is honor cultures. Because Trump, for many of us, was this famously belligerent but thin-skinned bully who couldn't back down, was just constantly, anytime anyone said anything, he needed to come back at them, even if he looked ridiculous doing it, and so on. And it seemed very off-putting to all of us, but as you point out, this is like a quintessentially honor culture. So what is an honor culture, and why do we see it in communities like this?
Well, an honor culture is a way of understanding reputation and conflict that makes it imperative that a person, particularly a man, demonstrates his toughness, his willingness to meet any insult or certainly an assault, but even just an insult, with a kind of fierceness and a willingness to use violence to avenge his reputation, to reestablish his reputation. And this is not you have men in all these communities have all kinds of personalities, just like in any other community. But they understand that they're expected to do this. And if they don't, they risk really losing status in their communities. And they also risk inviting further insult and even violence. And so I think it was pervasive in all three communities. I think some of the most colorful examples probably come from Ottumwa, from Iowa. Do you want to?
Well, there's a lot of examples. I mean, I would just say, by way of defining honor culture, just add that it's, on the one hand, it's unfamiliar to a lot of folks who live in highly educated bubbles like college towns and, blue urban centers, but it's sort of the default culture in a way, right? It exists around the world. It still exists in lots of places in the United States. And so it's much more common. It's a much more common mode of conflict resolution than we often sort of imagine. The play Hamilton reminds us that it used to exist in our national political culture, right? Because after all, Hamilton died in a duel defending his honor. But that play sort of misleads us too, because it sort of suggests that this honor culture is some ancient, barbaric, strange cultural thing that, existed in the past and we've done away with it. But in fact, as Steph said, it existed in all of these communities. And I guess we should give some examples. I mean, before I get to Iowa, I would start with Rhode Island. There, the mayor Policina very much practiced this honor culture. And we first saw this really in action during a town council meeting. Because every month or so, Joe Policina holds court, and various citizens come and they offer, they have various complaints and they want to sort of give the mayor a hard time. And Mayor Policina doesn't do what politicians might do in, say, our college town, right? When they hear a complaint, when people come to complain to Policina, he gives them hell, right? He starts calling them names, right? So in fact, and it doesn't matter who they are. In fact, there's one old woman who used to consistently go and sort of complain to him, and he would just let her have it. Policina would say, "You're a malcontent," right? Later, as the meeting spilled out into the parking lot, he even audibly called her a douchebag. So he's, he doesn't mince words. And when we asked him about this, we said, "Joe, what are you doing? Why are you so rough with these constituents, right? Why can't you, why can't you do what Michelle Obama does, right? Or suggest, right? She said, when they go low, we go high. Why can't you take the high road?" And his response was very telling. He says, "No, I can't do that. If I do that, they're just going to roll over me, right? It's going to show my weakness. They're going to take advantage of me." And so he said, "Look, I have to be a street fighter when it comes to politics. I have to be tough, right? Because that's the only thing that people understand, right? Is strength." And we saw this again, as Steph suggested, in Ottumwa. There, a fight nearly broke out at a local Democratic county meeting between a county commissioner who supported, this is back in 2016 during the primaries. So the county commissioner was a guy named Jerry Parker. He supported Hillary Clinton. And there was a guy named Alex Stroda who was on the other side. And they were fighting over who to endorse. And it nearly came to blows, right? It was basically, there was a belly bump, but not an actual fight. And again, those were two guys who couldn't just talk it out, right? There was a sense that, a disagreement had to be, and an insult had to be forcefully confronted, right? So that was sort of normal in these places, and that's also how Trump operates, right? For Trump, you're either a strong person or you're a weak person. And that's how he divides the world. And nationally speaking, some of the candidates that gravitated toward Trump early also shared some of that honor culture. I mean, you think about, guys like Rudy Giuliani or Chris Christie, they too have some of that in them. So that's a flavor for this culture. So to sum up too, I guess the final thing we'd say is that, Trump, I think you said this well, Aaron, but, Trump, to us, to people in our community, Trump seems like he's pathologically thin-skinned. And maybe he is, right? I'm sure Trump has all kinds of personality disorders, but that's not how it's necessarily read in the communities we studied. To them, his behavior is totally normal, right? It's totally normal, right? Of course you punch back. Of course you don't let things roll off your back, right? That's not how politicians behave in their communities. And so he doesn't seem weird, right? Even if he is on some level, right? Even if he does have all kinds of personality disorders, which I'm sure he does, it doesn't read quite that way in these places.
Was there a sense, because you're conducting these interviews after Trump has been in office for a bit, so they've gotten to see him not just in the bluster of a candidate, but actually as the leader of the free world, the disconnect between how they perceive him and how he is perceived elsewhere. So for example, you quote a handful of people about this, he's a tough guy. And so one guy, and I'll just read the quote. He says, "I think other countries are afraid of him, which I think is a good thing. I hate to say it, but with Bush and Obama, they were pushovers. With Trump, he's not a pushover. You're going to have to deal with him. There's no playing games with him," which was really striking because it became very clear in Trump's presidency that other world leaders were just constantly playing games with him. That they saw this, they saw his thin-skinnedness, his reactivity, his susceptibility to flattery, and they just manipulated the hell out of him. And so no one really was, they were maybe afraid of him in the sense that he was a loose cannon, but they weren't afraid of him as a tough guy that they had to take seriously. Were the communities aware of that disconnect, of how he was perceived on the world stage?
No, I think that the idea of a leader that might speak quietly and carry a big stick just doesn't make a lot of sense to them, and so in their own sphere of understanding, the way that you make people understand that you will not be messed with is through this sort of thin-skinned response, is this kind of machismo. And so I think that that was, how they understood. I was at a church service in Kentucky, and the minister there was trying to get the churchgoers to be more assertive in their faith. And he said, growing up, my big brother, always taught me. Basically, he meant in the context of working at a job site, like a construction site, don't back up, never back up. And that was seen as sort of a deep truth that had application in all realms of life. And I think so when they heard Trump making those sounds, it's a pretty high level, it's a pretty policy wonkish person who could then read and sort of trace actually what the consequences might have been, which you were just alluding to. I don't think they understood that he was doing the script correctly.
Yeah, I think it's important to bear in mind that what's happening here is a kind of identity politics. So when they see a candidate like Trump who behaves in ways that are familiar to them, in ways that they might behave, in ways that their leaders might behave, it signals to them that this candidate is one of them, and that's how most voters behave, right? They don't think very systematically, for the most part, about politics or ideology. Really, they're interested in candidates and and the extent to which they feel some sorts of a social proximity to them. And the closer they feel to them, the more they feel like they can trust them, right? And so I think the people we talk to just have a sense that Trump, because he seems familiar, because he seems trustworthy, he'll do the right thing in these on the international stage, in these contexts that are sort of really removed from their knowledge or expertise. And so in that way, they're really different from sort of the wonky people, one might meet in DC who are pulling their hair out because Trump is getting rolled, by China and Putin, et cetera.
One of the other things that gets characteristics of Trumpism, and it was certainly present throughout Trump's campaign, was nationalism, and then what looked like often racist dog whistles, if not just quite audible whistles. And that has seemed to be a characteristic, is that Trumpism and Trump supporters are intensely nationalistic and often have, call them, racially charged views. But what you found pushes back on that, at least in some ways, and you argued has more to do with sense of place. Can you talk about how sense of place plays out and what that says about, say, let's start with nationalism as a Trumpist phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I think all three of these were places we chose precisely because they represented a larger group of counties, mostly, that had voted twice for Obama and then flipped. And we were sort of interested in part because that seemed to be complicating what seemed like a clear-cut story of the kind of sort of bigoted appeal the appeal of bigotry that the Trump campaign represented. And then spending time there, what really stuck out in all three of the places was the localism. And we've talked about some facets of that. But these were all places where where the people who lived there felt deeply, deeply connected to their hometowns. And even so much that in the Johnston, Rhode Island community that we were in, they had long had a phrase that was Johnston first, long before Trump was on the political landscape. That there was a sense that of belonging to each other and needing to help each other and work for the community. And this sometimes then resonated out to a kind of nationalistic commitment. So, for example, in Ottumwa, Iowa, where there were these strong unions, where there had been the car industry, a lot of the people were very, it was difficult to buy a non-American made car in Ottumwa, and that was part of they linked sort of Ottumwa to the nation in a sense. And but in all of these places, there was that intense localism. So, for example, I was asking some women in Elliott County, Kentucky, early on. One of them mentioned that they had read Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. And there were some other women at the conversation that I was having. And the other women hadn't heard of the book, but they said, "Oh, was he from Elliott?" And then the response was, "Well, no, because he's actually from another county that's like an hour or two away, also part of, Eastern Appalachia, fairly indistinguishable from my eyes." But when they were told, no, not from Elliott County, from this other county, they all sort of laughed like, "Oh, okay, well, that's a different county. We don't know about that county." So even this, the county boundaries of this tiny rural county really mattered to the sort of civic imagination of the residents there.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say along these same lines is, when these are all places that are struggling to varying degrees and have been for quite some time. And so when Trump came around and said he was going to make America great again, what they heard is not so much that he was going to make the nation writ large great again in some general way. What they heard rather is that he was going to make Ottumwa great again, and Elliott great again, and Johnston great again. And so that very nationalistic rhetoric they heard in this very localized way. And those communities, and the fate of those communities matter to them, partly because, their social identities are so connected to those places, right? That's in these communities is where they're really socially known, where they really have reputations, where all their kin are, buried. And so to leave those places because they can't find the jobs or that they might need, for example, is a kind of social death. And here it's really a class-based difference, right? So if Steph and I get offered a job at, say, Harvard, and we go, our social reputation actually enhances, right? Because the nature of our communities is really different. It's not neighborhood-based. It's not especially place-based. We are known, our communities are much more based in our professions. And so, we're having this conversation with you across thousands of miles, and that's sort of the nature of our community, right? We don't know our neighbors all that well, and it's certainly not the center. It's not really where our social identities are fundamentally based. So, the fate of these communities matters in a sort of existential way to them, in a way that I think it's sort of sometimes hard for those of us who are part of the professional class to notice and to see. The other quickly thing I'd say about race is, it's I mean, as we mentioned, I mean, these are places that voted for Obama twice. And so in that way, they're also different from places that were touched by the Tea Party. I mean, as soon as Obama's elected, you get the Tea Party. And I'm sure some of that was, racially driven. It was our first Black president. But that wasn't, notably, it wasn't these communities. Obama really didn't create some massive counter mobilization in these places, right? These are places that voted for him twice. Obama was their president for 8 years. Some of these places did grow disenchanted with him in the second term, and particularly in Elliott County, where the policies of the Biden administration was particularly hard on on the coal industry there. But for the most part, these weren't places that had some allergy to Obama, right? These were places that, in fact, voted for him and supported him. And so I think there's, and in general, I think we'd say that to those studying Trump, is that I think I think it is true on the one hand that these folks, they do think of Trump as a kind of patron of the white working class in some ways. I mean, I think that's true. I do think they're especially by today, things have become more racialized. I'm sure if we went back into these communities, in the wake of BLM and everything else, the racial politics has changed, and perhaps they think of themselves more fundamentally as sort of white citizens, and that that's probably likely. But when we arrived there, I guess we were struck by the fact that they didn't particularly think in those terms, and their social identities were much more class-based. They were much more place-based. And I think we have to keep in mind that however much race plays a role, their identities are, their politics aren't reducible to race either. That they have other social identities, and that I think that's hopeful in some ways.
Yeah, I'll just to sort of just put a point on the comment with one example that comes to mind in terms of Elliott County. In Elliott County, Kentucky is a particularly white area. It's just a very there's very few people that are non-white.
In fact, if I could just add, I mean, I think it's the whitest county that voted for Obama, which makes it interesting. Yeah.
And so all the sort of political conflict there that sometimes can be racially charged in other places all happens within whites. So, for instance, when there's lots of grumbling about welfare, and they're all looking at their white neighbors who are ethnically, religiously identical, racially identical to them. And one thing I discovered among some of the older, this is not common among the younger, but the older people in Elliott County will sometimes complain about foreigners. And when they talk about foreigners, they mean people from Ohio who are coming across the border, or other counties, other white people. So they can, when there's lots of talk about distinctions, sort of invidious distinctions between us and them, or between, othering someone in the jargon of the academy. But in this case, they're othering white Ohioans. And so the racial divisions aren't always the most important divisions to them. Right.
And just a quick footnote to that. I mean, it should remind us that in some ways their identities are much more provincial than whiteness. White America, that's a pretty big group of people. And it's not a, for the most part, it didn't seem like that was a community they felt especially close to. And as Steph said, they feel like their white neighbors in a neighboring county are in some ways outsiders, right? And not part of their community.
The main issue of Trump's campaign, the thing that he ran on and drove home from early on in his presidency, was anti-immigration. That was his hobby horse. is it then the case that for these communities, an anti-immigration view is less about race, ethnicity, nationality, immigrants with their weird languages and weird foods, and more that if your community is intensely socially interconnected in a way that makes it look more like an extended family, then the immigrants look like the person who marries into that family and has a hard time fitting in because they didn't grow up in it, then they physically look different from us.
Yeah, I mean, you could see this in, I think most notably, actually, in Ottumwa, Iowa, which of the 3 communities we studied has the highest level of immigration, and they've come there really to work at the meatpacking plant. And I do think there's something to what you're saying, right? There's a sense that these folks are outsiders who don't quite share our norms, and therefore it's harder to have the kind of tightly knit, homogenous community. And we know from research on social capital that ethnic diversity, at least in the short and medium term, undermines community and feelings of trust and belonging. And so diversity is a challenge to community. And if your community is fundamentally neighborhood based, then immigration can be a cost to those communities. And again, it's really quite a contrast from our college town. I mean, here, we benefit from immigration in all kinds of ways. We have, we pay immigrants to, in California, Southern California, they cut our lawns, they clean our houses, they care for our children. They allow us to neglect our neighborhoods, right, and tend to the communities that we care about, which is really our sort of broader, professional, more diffuse, virtual kinds of communities. But in places like Ottumwa, those communities, again, are much more neighborhood-based. There is signs, though, that does sort of change over time as immigrants become part of the community. And this is why I think has more to do with culture than race. One Ottumwan, for example, told us about one of his neighbors, about the Latinos in the community generally. He said, well, they're not even, Mexican anymore because they don't speak Spanish, and it was his way of saying, this, it was a sort of interesting way of saying this wasn't fundamentally about race, right? Like, right. They may look a little different, but what matters is that they've sort of socially and culturally integrated, into the community.
Looking forward, then, for those of us who are deeply worried about what Trumpism represents on the national stage, look back at the 4 years that he was in office and I think the real damage it did to America and its institutions and so on, and are worried about the continuing prevalence of this often what are fundamentally illiberal views in the American electorate. What lessons should we draw from this in terms of, these people are speaking to genuine interest in cultural needs and affiliations, and the book is very good at pointing out how much those of us in the cosmopolitan cities don't understand the way that class really works. There's a very nice line in it where you mention how much in colleges the future generations of progressive leaders are taught lots of courses in gender and race, but very little, if anything at all, in class, and how important class is to this conversation. So what lesson should we draw from what you learned in these communities as far as understanding and preventing some of this from turning into the kind of really dangerous liberalism that I think we all fear?
Well, I think it is certainly heading that way. When we were in these communities at the time, it was still relatively early in their romance with Donald Trump, so they were not talking a lot of crazy conspiracy theory. Um, and um, and now we're really at a different place. And I think partly what it highlights is the dangers of identity politics in some ways. I mean, these are folks who Trump has become, there's a sort of cultishness that has really grown around Trump. And we were sort of there and saw the beginnings of that, but we were just at a rally in Wyoming. And Trump was there to officially nominate Harriet Hageman, who's taking on Liz Cheney. And, we saw lots of it. It was, everyone was in their Trump gear, like everyone had Trump t-shirts, lots of folks had Trump flags. And it felt, if you've been to an NFL game, it sort of had that feel to it, like everyone's on the same team, rooting right together. And it, and so, and maybe that would be okay if if Trump was less reckless and I think I think in many ways we're in this moment because of Trump's Trump's bad character. Not so much that he appealed to people's place-based or class-based identities and mobilized this other, this group of folks, but that the power of the power of that social connection has been so badly abused by him and so recklessly exploited. So I think what it's in a way I think there'll be more responsible people. I hope there'll be more responsible people who will follow some of his example and leave other parts of it behind. There'll be folks who will say, yes, I think there's responsible ways to appeal to these folks. Partly because there is a decent, I think it's important to remember, there's a sort of decent part of this world, right? There's sort of a decent morality there. Not all of it exports well up to the national level. So, I think honor culture, for example, for reasons we can explain, we think that is, maybe it's not great anywhere, but it works much better locally. And when it's exported up to the national level, it doesn't play out well. But there are folks who I think are trying to take some of the Trump's playbook. One good example is this candidate for governor in Pennsylvania, Fetterman, who's a Democrat and very Trumpy in all kinds of ways. He even, if you haven't bothered to look, he's got on one of his forearms, he has the zip code, a huge tattoo of the zip code of his hometown, and and talk about appealing to place-based identities, right? This guy's really figured it out. And on his other arm, he has the names of all those who died in his community while he was mayor, right? Again, very sort of personal kind of concern about his own hometown and community. And so, look, I don't know if he'll be what kind of governor he would be if he makes it that far. But it strikes me that's particularly for Democrats who are thinking about how to, or even really Republicans, right, who are thinking about how do you mobilize some of these social identities in a way that's less reckless than Trump. I think it can be done, and again, that's partly, and I think it'd be done responsibly, and that's partly because there's something, there's something admirable and something to like about the localism of these folks.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that we found that we highlight in our book are the moral vision behind them has to be understood. Even something like the boss nature of politics, which is often something that's considered very sleazy in the kind of communities that John and I have lived, really has a lot to do with this ethic of friendship and loyalty, and it's a way that voters understand friendship and loyalty more than any sort of policy-minded way of assessing candidates. I had one very, a woman tell me, actually, I have a few people say things like this, but one woman comes to mind in Kentucky who was very disengaged voter and worked a minimum wage, pretty crappy job. And she said, but she was one of the defenders of this sort of disgraced county executive. And she said, well, at least when David was in office, you could get a load of gravel when you needed one. And it was her sense of like, this was a true mark of friendship, so I think that certainly the boss style politics, which has to do with personal loyalty, which of course resonates very large with the kind of unusually intense following that Trump has at the national level. The localism, again, is about sort of community and loyalty. And so I think candidates that can speak that kind of cultural jargon can signal that that it's more important to signal that than it is to have it policies that are, the policies aren't the draw, I guess. I saw some Trump voters who said to me, Trump Democrats who in Kentucky, who said, oh, we have great internet. We got that under the Obama administration. But there was no sense of like that they gave credit to the Obama administration for this policy that clearly helped them, and they sort of giggled about. Or same with Obamacare. We saw people in Rhode Island say, oh, well, yes, I am dependent on Obamacare, but didn't give much credit. I think that what they want is a feeling of being represented by someone they can identify with and trust, and that they're much more attuned to social cultural clues, maybe all of us are, when picking candidates.
Thank you for listening to Reactionary Minds, a project of the UnPopulist. If you want to learn more about the rise of illiberalism and the need to defend a free society, check out theunpopulist.substack.com.